Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's guest is Chloé Valdary, who is a public speaker and a DJ and a teacher of the Theory of Enchantment. In this conversation, we talk about her perspective as a Black woman, thinking through the protests that are going on right now and trying to find some common ground where people from a variety of political viewpoints can come together in a common project of America and what it means to be an American and what it means to try to take our high ideals and to institute them in a humane manner. This is a wonderful conversation filled with personal experience and I think applicable wisdom for all of us right now to look on the brighter side of the things that we're trying to deal with. So without further ado, here's Chloé Valdary.
Anyway, how are you?
I'm good. We're just figuring out how the world is gonna end up. I was hoping you would
What a time
have.
to be alive, you
I
know?
know.
Seriously, I'm actually kind of excited. I'm,
You know
I'm,
what?
I don't know if I should be more pessimistic, but I'm kind of not, So I don't
Um,
know.
well, okay. Like people get upset if I just start talking, so we'll just cut in when we cut in. But I really want to know why you're excited. What is there to be excited about?
I mean, I feel like if you put aside for a second, like I truly believe that the rioters and the looters are a totally different camp
Okay.
from the majority of protesters.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that the majority of protesters that I'm seeing across the country truly want to move in a direction that's good and beneficial for the country, that's ultimately holistic.
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that like the proper leaders have necessarily developed yet or come out of these protesters, but I think for the most part, the majority is moving toward the majority is moving in a good direction, and the majority I think just could benefit
Hmm.
from leadership and the proper values and the proper principles directing people in the right way. And I think that there are certain leaders that I've seen in videos that exhibit those principles and that have the capacity to really inspire change in a positive, healthy way.
Hmm.
So that's why I'm optimistic.
Well, what do you think are some of those principles that we can focus on? Because there's a lot of material and there's a lot of
Sure.
different, currents going on and a lot of different ways of framing the discussion.
Hmm.
And my background is at the Evergreen State College, where they
Sure.
used a specific sort of framing that I saw was actually counterproductive
Definitely. Yeah.
when you look at how it led to its culmination. So, what are some of the principles that you think? I guess let's start by describing what the problem is or
Sure.
what the topic is, and then what are the principles that we could be focusing on.
So the problem is the writ large, unadulterated police brutality,
Okay.
right? With no sort of or very little, I'd say, very little from a national perception, right? The national perception is that there has been very little advancement in terms of gaining police accountability on a national scale. So yes, you have had in certain local precincts, obviously via the ballot box and via via democracy, you actually have had movement. You have had police reform implemented. There's an incredible thread that I can send to you after this on Twitter that shows a lot of the legislation that has been passed in different states, from Tennessee to Connecticut, that indicate real reform. But it's sort of a piecemeal approach. There's no national overall, president leading the consensus and trying to unite everyone together in this approach. There, unfortunately, and I blame the president for this partially, there is unfortunately a climate of divisiveness
Hmm.
and for political expedient purposes and nastiness that quite frankly mirrors the same nihilistic
Hmm.
tendencies, in my opinion, and nastiness of the looters and the rioters. So that's sort of how I see the problem. And then the solution has to entail leaders embodying the principles of, quite simply, caring for your fellow American, period. Right? How are we going to create a society that indicates that we care for each other, that we fundamentally are concerned for each other, that we fundamentally care about the well-being of each other? And that question is implicit in the protest against police brutality. That question is implicit when we speak out against looters, right? And people who are wrecking other people's businesses, especially for small business owners, but not just for small business owners. There's an argument that goes, oh, well, if you're destroying corporations, who cares? They can just stock up, again, they'll be fine. But the fact of the matter is that we are all interconnected. And if you destroy a Walgreens on the corner, the young middle-class African-American woman who was working there because it was an essential business now no longer has a way to make income, and now her mother can no longer go there to get her prescriptions, to get her medical prescriptions. So the solution is a holistic approach to in an attempt to answer the question, how is it that we as Americans can create and build a society where it is self-evident that we care for the well-being of one another, period.
And how does the aspect of race complicate that? And how do we enter into how do we bring the racial perspective into that in a way that that's balanced and still maintains what my value would be was individual sovereignty, which in certain respects, some anti-racist rhetoric dissolves personal responsibility, personal accountability, because it assigns some sort of, it puts the race in front.
All power, and it ironically ascribes, and this is, so Coates did this, Ta-Nehisi Coates did this in an article, in an essay he wrote in Atlantic magazine a few years ago, calling Trump the first white president and calling white supremacy the all-encompassing thing that's responsible for almost everything in the world, which is of course ludicrous by definition. But so it's a good question. I think my answer to that would be, honestly, we would have to call upon the wisdom of our ancestors, right? And this is why I think this is partially why I'm optimistic, because I think a needle can be threaded here between, the conservative faction that says, I love this country. This country is not the irredeemable monster that you have made it out to be. Yes, we have made incredibly horrendous mistakes. Yes, we have committed incredible sins, but we also have created and cultivated a society for human flourishing, and we've also made progress. So I think that the way you reconcile that faction with the faction that's saying, let's make America better, let's act in a more just way toward each other as citizens, is by saying to the conservatives, yes, you're right, and the civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Bayard Rustin and all of these individuals who we look up to and who, we have days named after in this country, these individuals were also the founding fathers and mothers of this country, right? So they too are the legacy of America, and they give us they give us something to be proud about when it comes to being proud of America, right? And so that's how you thread the needle, because obviously those individuals were dealing, needless to say, with the issue of race and with the issue of equality. And so you call upon I think you have to call upon the spiritual tenacity and root whatever movement you have in the spiritual tenacity of the founding forefathers and foremothers of America, which also include John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, but it must be said, include Dr. King and include Rosa Parks. And I think that's how you bridge the divide.
There's a common convergence with regards to our saints, our leaders,
yes.
our founders.
Exactly.
One quote that is kind of brought up a lot with with Martin Luther King Jr. that I've seen a lot, and I wanted to tease it apart because it seems to be being used to foment radicalism. It's a quote from his letter from a Birmingham jail, and it says he has a problem with the white moderate, and I'm wondering, in what way can we be radical and at the same time have a level head with regards to what it means to be a moderate, what it means to be conservative, or to resist the larger claims of, let's say, the Black Lives Matter movement,
Sure.
the more stronger anti-racist claims about white privilege and
Sure.
trying to right that in an equitable manner.
So, do you want to tease out that question a little bit more? Maybe if you do you have the quote in front of you? Do you want to
Yeah,
like sort of parse
let
it
me look
out?
it up. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've
Hmm.
almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to
Hmm.
justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who,
Hmm.
who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow
Hmm.
understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And there's a lot in there.
Sure. So, notice that in that section that you just read, there was nothing about rioting. There was nothing in that message that can, unless you're willfully misreading it, that translates that message into, and Dr. King is saying that you should now go out and riot in the streets. I think what Dr. King was saying in that message was he was actually condemning those white citizens who were not even for nonviolent protesting, right? They were just sort
Okay.
of going along and just being like any form of agitation, any form of direct, meaning like even spiritual agitation, right? So any form of direct action is itself antithetical to like my philosophy of being, which is like not what a democracy is by definition, right? It's not in a
Mm.
democracy one. This is the definition of the democracy, right? This is the meaning of democracy. One engages in protests and in direct action movements to try and bring about change. That's a part and parcel of democracy. But I think that's totally separate from white people randomly deciding to collectively kneel, um, not because they want to show solidarity with those who are marching on behalf of George Floyd, right? I think there's a difference between when you have an entire sea of protesters kneeling together, right? Black and white, cop and citizen. That's a totally separate thing from a bunch of white people deciding to kneel on the ground simply because they are white. That is not and was never Dr. King's vision. And
Why is that so attractive? It's disturbing to me
well,
just because of the religious connotations of that. But why is that
sure.
attractive? Do you understand that mindset, or could you project some understanding onto that?
I could try. I could do my best. I don't
Yeah.
like I come from a specific, I think, spiritual tradition
Mm.
that is that makes such a thing foreign to me. But I would say it actually, and ironically, has much to do with James Baldwin's observations in his essay "The Fire Next Time," about where he sort of like argues that there's a spiritual, there's somewhat of a spiritual dearth and spiritual malnourishment in certain areas of white American life, right? So this is sort of a gaping hole, a lack of spirituality and a lack of a spiritual foundation within, again, not all but certain sectors of white American life, and there is a need to fill that hole and to fill that gap and to fill that vacuum with something that gives people a sense of meaning and a sense of belonging. And this is the way in which some have decided to try to achieve that.
And from your spiritual perspective, or your spiritual tradition perspective, why is that improper or misguided? Or if it is misguided, let's say.
Well, it's because it's
incomplete.
not serious. It doesn't take seriously what we claim to be fighting for, which is justice and equality. And if we're fighting for equality, you can't kneel to me because you're a white person, right? If we're fighting for equality and you kneel to me, you are not my equal. So you are claiming on the one hand to stand for something, to stand for the concept of justice and to stand for the ideal of equality, and you don't have no idea what equality even means, right? You have no actual conception of what that means. So much so that you're willing to, prostrate and again, I think it's sincere for many people. I don't want to take away from the sincerity, but to the extent that one is willing to just prostrate before another human being because they are a different skin color is absurd, and no one can argue seriously that was Dr. King's vision.
There's a narrative that's being kind of asked people to take, that I've seen, that as a white man, I'm supposed to imagine the suffering and the fear of a person of color experiencing every day. And that imagining of that is somehow supposed to teach me something. I wonder, do you agree with that thought experiment? Do you think that it can lead to real understanding, or can my imagination fill that gap?
It's an interesting question. The question I would ask would be, to what end?
To what end do I imagine or summon that suffering and
so
that
so
fear?
let's do this thought as a thought exercise, right? A white person decides to do exactly what you just said, perhaps to bring about, let's say, I'm trying to steel man the argument. Let's say to develop empathy, right, for another human being who is attacked, to develop a sense of solidarity with another human being because they were attacked. And so if the argument is if the argument is basically I need to put myself in this person's situation or I need to imagine that as much as possible in order to be able to cultivate empathy for this person, I understand that up to a certain point, right? Because if the response to that is not, okay, so how can we now try to develop a more just society so that we're equal? But instead the response is, well, how can I now prostrate before you and, sort of switch positions, right? Which is metaphorically and symbolically what's being done when someone who is white kneels before another person of color, merely because they're two different skin colors, right? If that's the end goal of imagining yourself in another person's situation, then you've totally missed the point of that exercise.
of achieving, well, maybe not achieving in a final sense, but of re-engaging and reinvigorating the process of making a harmonious, thriving society.
You sort of like, you stopped yourself in the beginning of the process, which is a long process, right? You turned it into something performative, and it's also like not intellectually sound. Like it's not like people are not thinking through like, what is the moral philosophy I want to ground my activism and my protests in? What is my end goal ultimately? To really think about what justice means and the concept of justice and the concept of equality, and then how do I comport myself in such a way as a protester or as an activist so that I embody the principles of justice and embody the principles of equality? I'm not doing that if I'm kneeling in front of you because you're a different skin color than me.
Yeah.
No one is taking the time to, well, not no one. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but
yeah. You touched on something that I find missing in a lot of, I guess, political discourse writ large, is that there's a missing aspect of development. Like we're on a
Yeah,
developmental arc, and there's a slow maturation of somebody becoming wise. You don't just all of a sudden become
wake
right.
up, guys. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
like you're all of a sudden there,
yeah.
and the inverse of that is kind of cancel culture of oh, you said that one wrong thing
Sure,
that one
sure.
time. There's this
Right,
this frozenness of
right.
development, or just like this absence of understanding human beings as very slow to understand a complex system, let alone like society or something like that.
And the ultimate irony of that is that cancel culture is antithetical to the principles of criminal justice reform.
Could you expand on that?
I mean, the entire idea of criminal justice reform is based upon, like, if you want to reduce it to a theological principle,
Mm.
of the possibility of human beings, of the need of society to be able to forgive human beings for their wrongdoings, and the possibility of human beings to change and to rise above their circumstances, and to go
Hmm.
from being bad to being good.
Hmm.
Whereas cancel culture is often, or not always, again, not always, but often manifests itself in such a way where the sentiment is, you are bad now, you will always be bad, there is nothing redeemable about you, and in order to get you out of our society, we must shame you and
Hmm.
cancel you. So
Hmm.
the two concepts are, by and large, totally contradictory concepts.
Even the way of framing certain discussions in with regards to racial tension or racial justice on the low level of social media, let's say, I see a lot of people kind of trying to force other people to do or say the right thing, and it's really distilled into like the most lowest resolution when we come to yesterday of people not putting a black photo on Instagram, or
Sure.
people guilting other people
Sure, yes.
to participate in this thing, this kind of if you can do these actions, then you will be saved. It's a very
Right. Yeah, yeah,
rudimentary
yeah.
kind of process that doesn't really understand how do you actually change somebody's perspective with regards to racial understanding in America. Like how do you engage in that in a longer form, more mature way?
Well, unfortunately, this is one of the byproducts of, well, actually, this is one of the, yeah, of the byproducts of the American experiment. I
Hmm.
think a product of the excess of our hyper-consumerist society. So that things, um,
Like a brand
yeah,
almost.
yeah, like we unfortunately are confusing the pursuit of just. Some of us are confusing the pursuit of justice with, very fickle and superficial acts of posting things on Instagram that make us look good. Like, the pursuit of justice does not equal,
Hmm.
let me do things that make me look good in the eyes of, like, it's honestly, like, insane when you think about how superficial some of this is. But one of the reasons why I'm optimistic is because I think
Hmm.
people are actually sincerely searching
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
for a way to make things better. And so, as long as if they are searching, that means that there is hope. And if there is hope, that means that I think you can take advantage of things and really try to
Hmm.
inspire people to do this the right way and to go about this the
Hmm.
right way. And you see that when it comes to local leaders on a local level, in some of the videos that have been posted where leaders on a local level are telling people, stop rooting, stop looting, stop rioting. This is our community. We have to build our community. We have to, build up the community, not tear down the community. Um, which is to say that they believe in the future of the community, right? And I think that is something that might seem trite, but I don't think that should be taken for granted.
There's it's really difficult to pursue justice when you summon such a huge problem that I see in the 1619 project, let's just say,
Hmm.
where they try
Sure.
to reframe American history, the whole history, and root it in slavery.
Yeah.
And when you make the narrative that big, like it almost forces people into a panic or forces people
Right.
into a mode of interacting with this that's no longer human size. There's no humility in it because the problem is just so big. So how do you how do you propose that we frame the story of America with regards to race? Like, do you kind of have a narrative that you?
That's such a big question.
I know it's a big question, but like people are proposing these big solutions that I
Yeah.
don't think are necessarily solving things.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier about understanding that our founding fathers and mothers are both Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Dr. King and Rosa Parks. And so, in that sense, it's impossible to write off 1776 without writing off Martin Luther King and vice versa, because,
Okay.
you know, W.E.B. Du Bois had an amazing line in his, he was a, famous black anthropologist and really just a leader in the civil rights movement, an incredible writer whose works I think should be read. But in his book, The Soul of Black Folk, he writes, I might get this wrong, but I'm going to try to quote it verbatim. He says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not, right? Which is ultimately many things. It's an affirmation of, in some ways, the principles of Western civilization, right? He's saying Shakespeare is my equal and I am Shakespeare's equal, right? In terms of the values and the principles and the ideas that both of these individuals represent, right? And so there is no Du Bois without Shakespeare. And this goes to my ideas about which is a side note, like what do we do about the Western canon and all of the, you know, screaming over dead white men being in the Western canon and things of that nature, which is a side note. But like the point being that you can't, if you totally write off everyone that has been involved in the American project, including the sincere, authentic promoters and I would say protectors of the concept of liberty and justice and equality. Yes, even from 1776, then you destroy the foundation in whose name you seek justice, right? If in fact it is true that all men and women are created equal, which is what the founding document of this country states, then we can go about protesting on behalf of trying to make things just and bring about equality. Mm-hmm. So you can't have one without the other. You can't have, which is to say, you can't have the triumphs without the tragedies. You can't have the incredible path that we've come without the flaws. You can't destroy one without destroying the other. It's all interconnected. It's all interlinked. And so that is the story that I would tell. That is the narrative of America. And we, as American citizens, have to have the spiritual maturity to be able to hold both of those things at the same time losing our minds, right? Because, okay, I'm going to quote one more person.
No, please keep on
quoting. It's
quoting.
Probably annoying, but there's a great line from Longfellow in his Psalm of Life where he says, art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. Life is so short, we do not have time to tear each other apart. We just don't. So that would be the vision of an American and of a future America that I would project to the American people.
What are some of the snags that you find in pursuing that, either personally or like with your cultural I guess largely construed? What's some of the pushback that you get that you find interesting in your pursuit of this?
The pushback that I find interesting, that's a good question. Because
you have a social media presence, so I assume that some people kind of.
Oh, I don't. there's no pushback so far on my social media that I find interesting.
Uh,
There's
oh,
pushback
interesting. Okay.
there's pushback that I've heard from like interesting commentators, not directly pushing back toward me, but like there are other intellectuals and commentators whose work I've listened to, whose podcasts and interviews I've listened to, that bring up really challenging problems that I'm forced to grapple with, even in my optimism. But there's nothing really on social media writ large that I've seen that makes me less optimistic.
You're indefatigable. There's a couple too many
Oh,
syllables.
hopefully, let's hope so.
What do we? I like where you were going with the canon, and I remember when I was at Evergreen, we were doing a lot in my last class. We were reading these documents from a slave ship that a poet had done a lot of redaction from to make a poem out of this.
Oh,
This
interesting.
interaction, this captain talking about his cargo and completely in inhuman or dehumanizing terms. And I had this question because it seemed like that in grappling with that horror, it seemed the people were summoning that horror in a way that wasn't healthy. And I proposed to the class, at what point do we see ourselves both in the captain and the slave? At what point do we actually see that
Listen,
I am
but that is
both of
such a
those things?
that's such a difficult thing for people to grapple with. I don't want to underestimate the extent to which it is emotionally easy to just become a vapid nihilist. If one is not if one is not capable of grappling with the fact that yes, that we as human beings are, each of us, regardless of skin color, regardless of socioeconomic class, regardless of our station in life, are each of us capable of becoming both the captain and the slave, right? And so it requires an emotionally mature, educated citizenry and wise citizenry to be able to grapple with that. You know,
And
I guess I'm betting on the fact that we are
that we'll
as a
learn
country,
from our mistakes.
that
Okay.
we'll learn, and
Yeah.
we have already proven that to a certain extent we are capable
Yeah.
of that wisdom.
I think it's really easy right now for people to be disheartened due to the amount of energy that's being released right now, and to kind of lose sight that this will kind of peter out in certain respects. A lot of the mass protest that keeps on happening day after day, which is pretty amazing, like how long
Yeah,
it just keeps on going,
yeah,
will eventually peter out. But it's showing, it's putting us all in a pressure cooker, and it's kind of testing a lot of ideas with regards
sure.
to conservative ideas, progressive ideas, a lot of different anti-racist ideas and stuff. And what do you
Hmm.
think are some of the things that you've been pointing out about this? I really liked what you said earlier today on Twitter. I think it was today about where's the music, and
Yeah,
another thing
yeah,
like where's
yeah,
the food, and I was thinking when you were talking about a dearth of spirituality, if you don't have like that religious kind of framework, then you don't have all the cultural parts of that, the music and the food and
yeah.
all of the things that fill out the life. And
So, I'm sorry. What was your question?
it wasn't a question. It was more like
Oh,
just some of the observations about
well,
what's
like what I've
missing,
seen.
or
Oh,
what you're
I mean, yeah,
seeing.
music is I in my non-existent spare time DJ. Uh, and so and I live in Brooklyn. Pre-COVID, I made it a point to follow certain DJs and go very frequently to, clubs and stuff that had really excellent DJs, because I understand the power, especially from a spiritual perspective, of amazing DJs. To really call people to their higher selves, but also give people a sense of interconnectedness with one another. And it's important that we don't. First of all, it's important that we deeply understand and that we don't lose sight of the fact that we are incredibly interconnected as human beings and as a nation. So yeah, I mean, again,
Mm.
to reiterate my thoughts on Twitter yesterday, we need music. And I actually have, my roommate went to a bunch of protests, a protest yesterday in Brooklyn that was organized by the churches, and lo and
Mm.
behold, there was music. And I'm like, of course, when the church is organized, there will be music. I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about a rich Black spiritual tradition that has created and cultivated so much that is a gift in and for and to this country, right? And so why wouldn't we and why shouldn't we call upon that tradition? Because that's the tradition I think that's going to move us forward, even as it moved us forward in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. It feels like there's a tension. There's a tension for me between groupthink and community spirit,
I know.
and it seems like music is one of the safe ways to experience
You're like,
a
music is
collective
okay.
transcendence. Yeah,
You're like, music
but
is
like
okay. No,
certain chants and stuff like really kind of like
yes,
make me a
yes,
little
yes, yes.
wary.
One has to be discerning. And with it, I'm going to try to find this quote actually that I saw someone tweet out yesterday that really spoke to me, that really speaks to the issue that you're describing right now, in terms of making sure everything is, on point and consistent. Okay, so give me a minute. Oh, okay. So this is a quote by Dr. King. He said, "When the idea is a sound one, the cause a just one, and the demonstration a righteous one, change will be forthcoming. But if any one of these conditions are not present, the power for change is missing also."
What are the three? What are those three aspects? The idea, the cause, and
the idea, the cause, and the demonstration.
and the action or the
Yeah,
demonstration.
yeah, like the nature of the demonstration.
Yeah. In covering what's going on right now from my perspective of studying what happened at Evergreen and then watching similar things, I'm trying to carve out a place where I'm respecting the core and preserving the core,
Yes.
while still critiquing that and breaking it down into, is the idea sound, is the cause just, and is the action I guess noble or of a certain level of maturity. Those are three things that
Yeah.
you can navigate through, because people, one of the things that I'm wary of is that I saw at Evergreen a lot of people forcing other people to think in the same way and
Sure.
enforcing a proper way of thinking, and people will get really defensive if you start to critique. So I want to give them I want to give the people I disagree with the room to change their ideas instead of assaulting everything that they believe, but teasing it
Sure.
out into those different aspects is very
Well, to
helpful.
do that, you would require that you believe in human beings' potential to change, right? And this goes to my critique to many on the right, who are just totally don't believe in that. And
That people can change.
right, and I consider those people also to be people who ironically shout, "God bless America," but who actually, on a philosophical level, don't believe in America, because they don't believe in America's potential for all Americans. And so, yes, I also agree that, look, there's thesis, there's antithesis, and there's sense, and there's synthesis, right? And so it's very possible that what we're seeing now early on, and it is very early, people forget that these things really just started, these protests really just started. But it is possible that, like, yes, while we're seeing really weird performative examples of people genuflecting before you simply because of the color of their skin, coming from a good place, thinking that that's a good way to demonstrate empathy and compassion, it could be that over time this becomes something else, right? It could be that, with the right leaders, with the right idea, with the right cause, with people fomenting the right kind of demonstrations, that other protesters, in particular white protesters who are kneeling in this very weirdly sycophantic way, will change and will be influenced and inspired to embody their principles according to what justice actually means and what equality actually means. So nothing is inevitable, right? The fact that these people are doing this doesn't mean that they're always going to be doing it. So,
What are some of the examples, if you can summon off the top of your head, of the right being rigid or being resistant in a non-helpful manner to the ideals that they're performing? Is there like
Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk, um, I would say Donald Trump, but I don't really think he cares either way. Um, but yeah, I mean, those are two prominent folks, especially Candace Owens, with the Trump brand, with the MAGA brand, whose Twitter feeds and whose videos demonstrate a lack of care and concern for their fellow American. If that fellow American is, identifies as on the left, or identifies as liberal, or identifies as really having a difference of opinion on certain issues. So those two individuals fit the bill for that kind of behavior.
In a kind of Jonathan Haidt moral psychology framework,
Yeah,
a lot of the overreach of the left comes from their care harm value, and they
sure.
stress too much the care and the harm at the lack of other kinds of values. Let's
Sure.
say like the values of a sound idea because your cause is so just. So one of the things is how do you inspire care from the conservative who could probably overemphasize hardlineness or like confrontation or something like that. How do you relax that? Say, listen, you're not going to lose too much by actually understanding empathy, but
Yeah.
but at the same time understanding that empathy can come in the form of criticism, that
Yeah.
allyship can come in the form of opposition, of
Sure.
really being against an idea just to test the idea, not assaulting the entire framework.
So I think one of the things that Haidt said, if I remember that book correctly, is that security, right? Protection is one of the moral foundations of conservatives. And so the argument can be made that if you are essentially, and this is actually related to the conversation about police brutality, if you are overly tyrannical, essentially, in your response, you actually undermine your own security, right? If you are too harsh in your words, if you don't have the wisdom and discernment to understand the difference between discipline of a brutal nature, right, which is reprehensible, and the responsibility that you have to try to both cultivate and give to your fellow American wise counsel, then you undermine your own security. Mm-hmm. So I think that I would make the argument, I would make the argument in such a way that speaks to what conservatives claim to want, or a moral foundation of conservatives, which is security, and that's the argument that I would make.
Do you, and pardon me if this is, I don't like this question, but I want to ask it anyways. Do you consider yourself like a centrist then? Do you
No,
consider
that's a
yourself?
horrible term.
Okay,
I mean, no,
yeah,
it's
okay.
not a horrible term. It's not a horrible term. I take that back.
It comes with some baggage.
It's a meaningless term.
Okay.
It's a meaningless.
You're definitely not a fence sitter, but do you try to see both sides? Like, do you feel like you don't have a camp, or do you have like some sort of camp that ties you into other people, or do you resist that?
I am an artist.
Yeah.
That's the only way I know how to answer that question. And I've received that question before, and that's exactly how I've answered it.
That's basically what I say too. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I think that the purpose of art. First of all, I was for your listeners who may be interested. I was very much moved by a book by Ralph Ellison on this called Shadow and Act. So most people know Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. The funny thing about Ralph Ellison is like he was one of the few Black authors whose seminal work was considered by both Black and white American critics at the time that it came out to be not an African American book, but an American book. Even though its subject was race, and its subject was sort of inner tensions within the Black community and tensions between the Black and white community. So the subject was race, but this book, Invisible Man, was actually considered to be like the perfect American novel, which I think is fascinating. But anyway, his book Shadow and Act, which is a series of interviews with him, talks about the importance of art. 'Cause obviously, he saw himself as an artist fundamentally. And he argues that the purpose of art is to create order and meaning out of chaos. And so I think in a very simple way, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of escape velocity one needs to achieve to overcome or escape the designation of an identity. I can see, and I don't mean this offensively at
Sure.
all, but it might be. But I can see that there might be some sort of frustration if you are a black artist to escape that black designation in a way. Do you feel that at all? Is that a reality at all to try to
No, no,
transcend
because
that?
no, because I think that where I'm coming from is still very much rooted in the Black tradition.
Hmm.
I'm saying that the Black tradition is rooted in the American tradition, and the American tradition is
Yeah.
rooted in the Black tradition. It's inseparable,
Yeah.
right?
What
So
is that? What is that black tradition according to you? I mean, I guess is it a pedigree of like just a series of leaders in your past? Is that how you conceive of
I
it?
think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
people should understand that like the first elementary school I attended was called Langston Hughes Elementary School. Right since the time I was 6 years old, the first poem I was ever forced to memorize was a poem about Harriet Tubman. The second poem I was forced to memorize was a poem by Maya Angelou called "Still I Rise." Right, but so black leadership and black flourishing within an American
Mm.
context was
Hmm.
at the very foundation of my educational experience, and quite frankly, it is it. And this is where folks like Hannah Jones have a point when she talks about this specifically. It is a tragedy if white Americans aren't receiving this kind of education because there's so much richness to this educational experience that I received, this educational gift that I received. There's so much richness that helps perpetuate American democracy um,
Hmm.
that comes from the Black tradition. So no, I don't really see like I'm not in the camp of, although I appreciate him as an author, I'm not in the camp of Thomas Chatterton Williams, right? I'm not someone who believes that we no longer should use the terms black and white to describe, skin color, for example. I'm not. That's just not my. I don't feel that it's necessary for me in order to achieve ultimately the goal that I want to achieve.
Hmm.
So
It from watching your work and listening to you now, it seems that you put a stress on a certain aspect of, I guess, black culture. And I can see that from a low resolution white person trying to conceive of what it means to be black in America, I could potentially put too much stress on the suffering and the fear. When we were talking about that thought experiment, like I'm supposed
sure,
to project this constant
right.
struggle, but at the same time, if I'm not recognizing that there's so much flourishing that came about because of that struggle, it actually makes the struggle more human. It turns it into a actual net positive.
Yeah. So if you are learning quotes in the classroom and you're not also learning Maya Angelou in the classroom, then something is wrong with the classroom. Like
Hmm.
if you are only learning uh, Ibram Kendi, but you're not also learning James Weldon Johnson, who wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which is considered to be the Black national anthem, which I think should be the American anthem because it's so arguably
Hmm.
much more powerful than the American anthem. You're just missing out on your own history,
Mm.
right? It's like telling half the story, and there is an incredible story of resilience and triumph and overcoming, which can inspire any American.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, so, so
Is
yeah,
there's a process almost of universalization that I could see people not wanting to occur because it might strip the flavor out of that black experience. But if you superimpose that overcoming narrative and universalize it so that I can internalize that,
yeah.
I can see some sort of resistance to me co-opting or appropriating that story for my
Sure.
own ends. But at the same time, that just seems like one way of keeping us separate, in a way, of me
What
not
seems
being
like,
able to.
oh,
Uh,
you not being able to draw from the legacy that,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, or like
yeah.
erecting some sort of sacred barrier between me and the black experience in America, which
Well, it's
like.
just, it makes these, what that does is achieve the thing that folks like Hannah Jones claim to be fighting, right? If you are a white American and you don't know about the tradition of overcoming of Black America, as manifested in, especially obviously the civil rights movement, but also the poems and the artistic literary work of the Harlem Renaissance writers. And like, if you are just totally unaware of that, then you are fundamentally unaware of the fullness of American history. And Hannah Jones's line is what? No one's fully telling the full story of American history, right? But this is the other side of that, right? No one, to my knowledge, is telling white Americans this story. So I agree with her point that the full story hasn't been told. But my retort to her would be that she is not telling the full story either.
Mm-hmm. I think that we do a disservice to our culture by stressing so much in the theory camp and a certain strain of activism that's academic minded and sociological and has all these ideas like critical race theory and white fragility and all that, going about it that way through your brain. Sorry for this, but it's like having a relationship with somebody just through a mental way. There's no sensuality, there's no embodiment.
Yes,
and going through.
You should use that word. Crazy, you should use that word. Okay, I'm going to read from you. I'm going to read for you and your audience a passage from James Baldwin's essay, "The Fire Next Time," which was written in 1968. And I know this essay very well because I teach it in the Theory of Enchantment course. Okay, so he was talking about the power of jazz and blues and other genres of music that have come directly from the Black experience in America. Okay, so he says, white Americans do not understand the depths out of which such an ironic tenacity comes, but they suspect that the force is sensual, and they are terrified of sensuality and do not any longer understand it. The word sensual is not intended to bring to mind quivering dusky maidens or priapic black studs. I am referring to something much simpler and much less fanciful. To be sensual, I think, is to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. It will be a great day for America, incidentally, when we begin to eat bread again, instead of the blasphemous and tasteless foam rubber that we have substituted for it. And I am not being frivolous now either. Something very sinister happens to the people of a country when they begin to distrust their own reactions as deeply as they do here, and become as joyless as they have become. It is this individual uncertainty on the part of white American men and women, and I think of Robin DiAngelo when I read this. Seriously, this inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives that makes the discussion, let alone elucidation of any conundrum, that is, any reality, right, so supremely difficult. The person who distrusts himself has no touchstone for reality, for this touchstone can be only oneself. And this goes to your point about you're not having a real relationship with another person, right? You're just, such a person interposes between himself and reality nothing less than a labyrinth of attitudes. Sound familiar? And these attitudes, furthermore, though the person is usually unaware of it, is unaware of so much, are historical and public attitudes. They do not relate to the present any more than they relate to the person. Therefore, and this is the line that some people like to quote without quoting the rest and like applying it. Therefore, whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves.
Which is rooted in a sensual understanding or a sensual communal vibration of some sort. And
in order to allow yourself to do that, you actually have to see the other person next to you, regardless of his or her skin color, as a human being. Yeah. Not as a political category, not as a prop for your performative, politicking, as an actual human being, and yourself as a human being.
Yeah. Well, I
right?
mean, and we can abstract that to a certain degree from his critique of what he calls white men, white women, but our society itself is feasting on the foam rubber of Twitter, and
Sure.
our dialogue is reduced to this disembodiedness, and a lot of our beliefs, especially in the younger generation, are coming by way of this very disembodied, literally disembodied voices are
Yeah.
creating their reality now. And so the question of overcoming difference with regards to identities is almost made impossible by the medium of social media because it denies so much of our experience, and it reduces us
Yeah.
in such a way.
I don't know if it's impossible. I think we can choose to curate our social media platforms in such a way that actually reflects our values. I think social media is just a platform and a stage, and we choose what play we will, present. But it's an active choice. I don't want it to seem like, we're sort of like not autonomous to some degree. And it's like my Twitter is actually very, for the most part, quite lovely. Like my Twitter feed. I mean, obviously, I often respond to things that I find unthoughtful or unwise, but my Twitter feed is mostly nice. Yeah.
What's next for you then? What project are you working on? You have your course set up. Are you working on a book or a video series or like a dance
Uh,
class or something like that?
you're like, or is it a dance class? It's a dance class, isn't it? No, I would be horrible at choreography. I don't have the patience to actually stop and teach people how to dance. But anyway, I am going really all in with Theory of Enchantment. So I'm trying to, just build that up and set that up and get that course out to as many people as possible because I think it's really good for character development and trying to promote the principles that we've been talking about in this conversation. So I'm really
Would
trying
you
to.
be able to plug that now? What is the theory of
Yeah,
enchantment? Yeah.
definitely. So happy you asked. So Theory of Enchantment is my startup that I started about a year and a half ago, and it's a course that teaches character development and social emotional learning. It's based upon three principles that I developed, three principles for the betterment of human society, and this idea that you can't be in a healthy relationship with others unless you're in a healthy relationship with yourself. Right. So the three principles are treat people like they're human beings, not political abstractions, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy, root everything you do in love and compassion. And so the course is based upon those three principles. So in the first third of the course, you do a lot of self-work. And the beauty of this course is that it uses pop culture and developmental psychology to teach it. So we study empathy, but we also study, for example, we use Kendrick Lamar and John Mayer and various artists. Notice it's the artists again.
Yeah.
That's why I identify so heavily with the artists. The work of a lot of artists that really grapple with this issue of the human condition. So in the first third, individuals do the work of learning what it means to be a human being, what it means to be imperfect, what it means to be capable of doing good and doing evil, what it means to have parental baggage, what it means to have intergenerational baggage, how to carry that in such a way that you don't overcompensate for it, and how you can, in learning about the self, begin to learn about the other. And then sort of the last two parts of the course expand upon that. But it's cool because we study, there's so much in there that we study. We study, like I said, Kendrick Lamar. We study the songs of John Mayer. We study James Baldwin. This essay that I mentioned earlier is in that course. Another essay, The Problem with Protest Novels, which is just a perfect essay by James Baldwin that was written in 1948 that perfectly really addresses some of the issues in our nation right now. We study cults as well, but we study cults in conversation with James Baldwin, which is a fascinating exploration. But we also study Disney, right? We study The Lion King to explore the principle of Stoicism, because there's actually a lot of Stoic teachings in The Lion King. And we also study Stoicism as it was practiced in the Civil Rights Movement. There's a lot more Disney that we study. We study the writings of Jay-Z. We study certain ads from Nike that are super dope, and Michael Jordan talking about the human condition. So there's a lot of really cool stuff in there. And yeah, so I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited about getting as many people to enroll in it and to go on the journey of taking the course.
And how is it laid out then? Like it goes every 6 weeks or something? Like, is it a cohort that
No,
you usher through?
no. So it's an online course. So individuals can enroll in it. So it's on Teachable, if you're familiar with that platform for online courses. If you're an individual and you want to take the course, it's online. And if you're a teacher, if you are a teacher wanting to teach your students, there's a separate subscription-based tier for that, because the way I advise teachers to teach it is to go through the course with their students, basically. Which is a slightly different framework from the online course, but it's the same content. So if individuals want to take it, they can enroll in the course in Teachable, and if teachers want to take it and or teach it, they can do the subscription. And it's all on theoryoфenchantment.com, which is my company's website.
Which will appear on the screen right now. So in sum, right now, what do you think people should be paying attention to? Like in all the sea of footage and the sea of opinions going on, where should our eyes be? What should we be attending to?
They should be attending to a lot of the folks leading efforts to clean up some of these cities that have been broken. They should be attending to, if they can, donating to organizations that are handing out food and water bottles and just aiding people and trying to work together to build, and in some cases rebuild these cities. They should be trying to support business owners as well, small business owners especially. If you believe in the ideal of Black Lives Matter, you should be supporting small Black-owned businesses that are in some cases under threat of being destroyed, and in some cases have been destroyed. So support those GoFund accounts that have been set up for folks whose businesses have been destroyed. You should also be looking towards individuals, influencers that are posting real, concrete legislative action that can be taken to bring about police reform. And I don't have a list off the top of my head, but I can give you a list of Twitter accounts that I think are pretty awesome and pretty decent. So those are the two things I would focus on. And if you ever run into a protest with deeply resilient spiritual music being sung, you should join that protest.
Join in.
There's something there. There may be a philosophically consistent moral being upheld in that protest.
Yeah, by their tunes you shall know them, in a way.
Yes, very well said. Yes. I 100% believe in that. As a DJ, yes, 100%.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.